A stand symbolizes a character in universe, so they get their symbolism to work with. If you're given a mirror of how you solve problems, you then also apply it through your way of solving problems, and the main JoJo of each part has skills and struggles so they can be a role model for their story's specific message. This is about what's behind each stand power the main JoJos from parts 3 through 8 can use, rather than what they look like. Starting with Star Platinum, Jotaro was the first stand user main character, so on top of his own themes, he was also an ideal for the power system. On some level, solving problems means you're making physical change. Even persuading people results in physical actions happening, and you don't overcome a challenge unless you're sometimes on the offense. So the way to symbolize that is through a source of cause and effect that produces physical attacks. Jotaro's personality embodies all of the ideal qualities and principles of solving problems. On the surface, he seems threatening and violent, but he's that much more cautious about what he fights and what the consequences are, so that he's doing the right thing. There's never a limit to the number of questions you could ask or defense you could play, but you can't resolve anything unless you strike. So the ideal stand user is someone who hits strong and often, but has the insight to match, and that's what we see of Jotaro. He doesn't try to restrain how violent or aggressive he is himself. He just thinks even more and does whatever's necessary to make sure his outcomes get the most done and don't cause problems. That's why when he doesn't understand Star Platinum, he's willing to throw himself in jail to keep people safe. But once he does, he constantly strategizes, tests scenarios, and takes hits, and no matter how much pressure, he'll keep thinking and collecting information until he eventually reads and outwits the person behind the power he's fighting against. With human limits, your brain can only focus on so much at a time, so usually there's a trade-off between how much you can focus on and how finely you can focus on what you do. In Jotaro's case, he's problem-solving so thoroughly, and in order to be flexible with new obstacles, he prioritizes concentration over range. His stand symbolizes his methods by being extra physically capable, as overall, it has the power to give Jotaro more room to act. Its limits are almost flexible, and before he fully understands his power, he expands on it through his method of solving problems by concentrating and releasing aggressive power further through a small part of the stand. His time stop comes more from expanding his opportunities to act by speeding up than forcing the rest of the world down, which at the very least gives him a fighting chance in this conflict that was fated for at least 500 years to be something whoever is on top of the world would be vulnerable to. Then for Josuke, with the second main stand, he was supposed to have a similar level of power. His theme isn't to amplify actions, so his stand has slightly worse and more rigid limits compared to Star Platinum, but he has the same aggression and wit as Jotaro. But instead of having extra intellect to control his aggression, Josuke's premise is that his power comes from outbursts of aggression he loses control during, like a berserker, which eventually got reworked into Joshu. So Josuke makes up for his outbursts, which is why his power is to restore things, and channels his outrage deliberately to accomplish goals in a transformative way, which is why he can adjust how objects revert to make something new. Josuke's ability, more specifically, reconnects the physical building blocks of something broken to stabilize it. So if the whole depended on those building blocks to stay in existence, or those building blocks aren't around anymore, he can't help. Anything non-physical spread across those building blocks, like the chain reaction going on in a domino line, or the soul of a person, won't be brought back by lining those building blocks back up. So the most he can do is if something non-physical is at risk of disappearing because it's missing vital building blocks to keep itself functioning, he can transformatively connect some other materials to be part of its body and stabilize it before it's lost. The idea is that someone can perform actions to make up for outbursts or harm, but that doesn't make up for the damage itself, and some lines can be crossed forever. You can only make the most of what you have going forward, and there's only so much you can repair since you can't undo the past. Stands symbolize agency, so you have to accept reality, where you're at the mercy of the external world and other people's own agencies, which means the past, even unfortunate or compromising outcomes, happens. The highest agency is symbolized as having the power to take more turns than somebody else. It doesn't just grant them the power to win their battles automatically. There's permanence people have to move forward from and work around instead of still being able to call into question. And that finality is best symbolized by the concept of death. So nobody would have a power that directly brings the dead back to life. Giorno, however, breathes new life into things. He was heroic potential that descended from Dio, and his goal was to revitalize his corrupt and decaying society by using the structure of power put in place to make change once he could infiltrate it and take over. So he injects his stand's energy into inanimate objects to empower them with life, creating something new out of them. He's charismatic like Dio, but a good leader, supporting supporting the lives under him so they flourish freely and follow him out of respect. That's why he has to earn the favor of his animals, or work with their instincts, instead of controlling them directly, and why he has a branch effect to protect the lives he maintains by reflecting damage done to them as long as they're actively powered by the stand and not just kept alive as part of a real creature's body. Plants stabilize on their own, so Giorno only needs to give them more energy to accelerate their growth, and animals are limited in size as high energy creatures, but by making them reflect damage, their growth could push through people's skulls, and they could even be dangerous to stand users. If Giorno pours his energy into an existing creature, he can mentally empower them, but in a way that really only disorients their agency, like the charismatic leader he can be. Bruno's death was permanent, and Giorno could not bring him back to life. He could only give him a second wind, because he could create something new out of the dead organic material, so he changed the function of Bruno's body to something that could act as a vessel and anchor a lingering soul like Bruno's ghost as a driver. Jolyne is a version of Jotaro put through the opposite scenario of Giorno's. Instead of being an infiltrator with a path to power free from his enemy, she was imprisoned thanks to a rule of the universe that her family are terrorized by Dio. Instead of getting a battle for the Requiem arrow, the struggle against the enemy's win condition had been lost before she was even born. Jolyne's been sabotaged from the start, but she puts all of herself on the line and uses everything she has for more control. She's willing to go through any torment or suspend any privileges to succeed in the long term, as her source of agency is unraveling and stealing herself as much as possible to gain more control over what she's made of and grant her more wiggle room in the hope that there is still some way out of the aftermath she was born into when there isn't. Even her method of getting a stand was the remnant of an arrow that had already been destroyed in some prior battle. Johnny is a case of someone who lacks independence and can't fend for himself against hurdles in the wider world. The point of his story is to show how someone could learn to manually stand on their own during life's ongoing conflicts and struggles for wealth. At first, he chases any signs the universe gives him of hope, lacking the ability to get on his feet on his own, unless he's presented with some kind of miracle. He's not worthy of being a stand user, but the corpse is pulled to him because deep down, without any competence or effective ways of thinking, as long as he's still alive, he's willing to scratch and claw. That desperation is enough of a drive to have things revolve around him, so as long as he has the corpse part in his body, he can tap into the stand he'd otherwise lack the capability to retain. I think that's why it's called Tusk. It's the power he's given for the fighting he's willing to do out of desperation. But as Johnny learns the steps to solving problems on his own, he's able to grow what it does. It's just that having to learn those skills manually means he has to add them on consciously and doesn't always have the time or opportunity to. As a trade-off, since he's fully conscious of them, his best case scenario form gives him really fluid use over the composure of his stand. But his stand is divided into acts that build on each other, and he learns independence through two separate paths of progress. The core principles to being independent let him grow into a full stand user and properly draw out his power. First, he learns to spend in the short term to make long-term rewards. Loss isn't just loss, it's also a chain reaction in transit. So by moving forward and chasing Oyekamova, who keeps dropping attacks back toward them, Johnny gains the confidence to expend his nails and launch them distances as bullets, which pays off because they deal lethal damage and he turns out to regenerate them back. Second, he needs to learn from Sugar Mountain that possessions have value in being used, and therefore they come and go for someone really standing on their own. When he beats the tree, he stops emotionally depending on miracles granted by the universe. His resolve is no longer anchored to any external thing, so he can retain his stand without the corpse. Then third, he learns a vital lesson for independence to truly make his ability his own. But it's also a tactic that improves your strength for solving problems. Axel was a cautionary tale to teach Johnny that when you're in a situation with no clear or good way out, any miraculous outcome that could be possible is one that depends on what you can still do. So instead of panicking or attacking blindly, you should attack your current way of looking at the situation until you arrive at something solvable. Johnny's acts represent the tactics that he incorporates into his arsenal. Act 2 is from Johnny learning to look for his own methods of success in his environment instead of seeing the world in terms of his enemy's methods. And that's why the cautionary tale is Sandman, who incorporates and echoes sounds like how he relies on the principles of his enemies to fight. Then lastly, Act 4 comes from Johnny learning to treat the wider environment as building blocks to achieve his methods instead of relying on the universe to arrange them for him. Our final JoJo is Other Josuke, who, just like the gap in his front teeth, comes from a gap in calamity. He was born through a miracle without past memories or agendas like the kinds of things Wonder Review can tie people down with. So outside the bindings of the tightly wound chain chains of cause and effect Toru had already wrapped around Morio. Josuke's agency comes from this gap, because it lets him pull things out or steal them for himself. He can temporarily remove a quality or extract it and store it in a bubble. Opposite Calamity, any individual bubble is delicate, but you can cluster them or even layer them, whereas you only need to remove one link to ruin a chain. So, when Josuke embraces where his agency comes from, his Joestar heritage that persists without superficial details like memories, he can use the spin to expand on his gap and pull out a link from Wonder of You. Josuke wants a place to belong, but his flaw throughout his story is that he chases after answers that don't matter, because they relate to the past and not where he belongs now. He would never care about his memories if he obtained them, because when Norisuke tells him about Yankees to box his personality, he doesn't feel a calling. He's dressed as a man of the sea, someone who needs to work away from home in order to provide for it, because he inherited his outfit from Kira. But what he comes to realize by the end of the story is that he himself is a man of the land, someone who's allowed to live at his place of home, because where he really belongs is with the Higashikatas he moved in to live with at the very beginning. So when he does get the data on his past as Josefumi at the end, he realizes that, just like Kira, it's not who he is anymore, which leaves us with Jodio. November Rain is a song about someone who's letting a relationship die because instead of trying to communicate and work through the struggles that any relationship inevitably endures, they'd prefer to shut the other person out and go their own way, out of paranoia. But there's a lot of part 9 to go.